We're going to spend most of this episode talking about Snow Leopard. One of the things we talked about preparing for this that I want to make sure we cover, because I think it would be super interesting for people listening, is your experience moving away from that service style business. So just as a quick overview, in ghostwriting, you're effectively doing this on a one-off basis, one project at a time. It's service-based. And all the businesses that you have now are more recurring revenue software style businesses. And I know that that's been a huge unlock. Just talk about that experience and how much better of a business the businesses you're operating now are versus the services business you had before, and what you learned by taking this leap of faith to kind of transition from one to the other.
Oh man, I don't know if we have enough time. There's so much I
We've
want.
got time. We've got time.
So the reason I started a ghostwriting agency was because in 2016, wow, I quit my job, decided to go all in on being a freelance writer, and fell into this world of ghostwriting. And all of a sudden, I went from being this commodity freelance writer to these CEOs going, "Hey, if you're my ghostwriter," and they were the ones who gave me the language. I didn't even know what a ghostwriter was. They said to me, "Oh, you're my ghostwriter." And I was like, "Oh, cool. Now I'm a ghostwriter." And I started just by demand. I would just increase my rates, $100 for an article, $200 for an article, $300 for an article. And I remember I got up to like $800 an article, and I could write these articles in 30 minutes. I mean, I was very used to writing in this fashion because it was all after my Quora journey and everything. And I went and met up with my friend in Atlanta, very close friend of mine. And I told him what I was doing, and he was the one who's like, "Well, why don't we just split this out? We'll hire writers, we'll hire editors. The editors will do the calls, the writers will write. You'll teach them how you do what you do, and we'll scale this. We'll build a business." And we ended up scaling that to probably at our height, it was probably about 2 million in revenue, 20 full-time employees. So, 10 writers, 10 editors, and it was a little, probably no more, 24, and a couple salespeople, all of them full-time, all of them salary. And this all happened in like 18 months, and I was 26, 27, and it was super intense. And we had 80 clients, and so, we did it, like we scaled it. But the problem was, because you're providing a service, first of all, ghostwriting is about as subjective as it gets, right? I mean, you're basically giving something to someone going, "Hey, does this accurately reflect you and your voice and your beliefs?" And I mean, that is you're not selling like plastic widgets, you know what I mean? That is a hard thing to do. And then second is your costs all scale linearly. So every time we bring on a new client, I have to go, well, who's the writer and who's the editor? Every time I bring on 6 new clients, I need another writer and another editor. And so it doesn't take very long for your overhead to get really, really high. You're supporting all these salaries. I say high relatively. All the people with $30 million businesses are like, "What are you talking about?" But relatively at that time, it felt like a lot. And so eventually I got to this point. I went on this trip. It was the classic entrepreneurial story. I went on this trip and found myself, lying in the lagoon in Mexico. And I was like, what am I doing? Why did I build this business? And it made me realize that no matter how hard I worked, I was running a business that could only scale linearly. The more services I sold, the more people I needed to hire. And that was it. And so I left that business. I took like a year and a half off. Pandemic hit. And I just asked myself some really hard questions. Like, if I'm going to spend all this time building a business, what sort of business do I want to build? And the only thing I kept telling myself was, I want to build something that has quote unquote infinite scale. It needs to be able to scale without me. The whole ghostwriting business was dependent on me, And so where I landed was education products, software tools, paid newsletter, books, right? All of these things, it doesn't matter if one person buys them or a million people buy them. It's the same thing. And drastically different businesses in so many different ways. But yeah, I mean, I think a lot of people have to do what I did. You have to go through that journey and kind of learn that on your own.
I mean, clearly a big point that you're making there is around linearly scaling costs. This point that obviously a service business relies on you, and so you clearly want to move to something, and it makes enormous sense for anyone that's ever seen one of these businesses in the deltas. I mean, it's just insane. It's like moving from an asset heavy business model to an asset light business model. You're generating revenue off of one time sales that are hard to replicate. Versus having a product that can just sell itself, and then you're refining the funnel. Very, very different. But one of the questions I want to ask is, there it sounds like it's all positive. What has been the challenge, or what have been some of the challenges about building a business like the businesses that you have now? Just talk about that side of the coin.
Yeah, I mean, I had, one of my mentors used to say, you're always picking a bag of problems. It just depends on which bag of problems you want to deal with. And so the benefit of building things that have infinite scale, and infinite has quotes around it because, you have to grow it.
It's not infinite human beings, so.
Yeah, it's not infinite human beings, and it doesn't just immediately go to level 1,000, right? Like you still have to build it and grow it. But it's the simple fact that you're dealing with more people, which means everything gets heightened, right? Positive messages happen 10 times more, negative messages happen 10 times more, customer requests happen 10 times more. Everything happens 10 times more. And so the good is more, and sometimes the things that you don't enjoy as much are more as well. And so you kind of have to be obsessive about creating processes that ensure that you try and protect your time and your attention as much as you can, because otherwise it's very easy to fall into the same trap. Like I catch myself doing it all the time, where you have something that's scalable, you have a digital product, or you have a community or something, and then people start asking you questions, and it's very easy to fall right back into the, oh well, I'm going to give you personalized something, and then you're right back to, it's dependent on you, you're selling your time, right? And so breaking that belief in your head is, that's been very challenging for me, especially because all I knew were services. I didn't even really know about digital product businesses until a couple years ago, to be honest. I only knew service because I worked at an ad agency. That was the model I had.